from an entrepreneur's perspective, you want to build your conviction on why your particular idea and your particular solution is one that can survive the next 5, 10 years of political upheaval, because it is a solution that the world needs, wants, and will eventually have to figure out how to pay for.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate technologies. I'm your host, Samia, and today we are speaking with Akshat Rathi. Akshat is a London-based senior reporter for Bloomberg News. Previously, Akshat was a senior reporter at Quartz and a science editor at The Conversation. He's been widely cited, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. He's won numerous awards for his journalism, including the Whitman Basso Award from the Overseas Press Club for Best Reporting on International Environment Issues, and the British Journalism Award commendation for an investigation of ExxonMobil's emissions. Akshat has a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Oxford and a BTech in chemical engineering from the Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai. And today we are talking about his very first book, Climate Capitalism. We cover a range of topics, including first, what is climate capitalism? What does that mean? When startups should start thinking about partnering with fossil fuel companies, how policy, finance, and shareholder activism play a part in allowing climate tech to scale, and how founders and investors should think about this, and his views on the climate tech market. And now on to the episode. Akshat, thank you so much for joining us. I am going to open with the title. So, what does climate capitalism mean within the context of your book? Because I think sometimes people in the social impact world perceive the word capitalism in a negative way, especially when it's paired with an issue like climate change. But in fact, your book highlights how capitalism can absolutely be the driving force for climate change mitigation when it's done right. So what does that title mean?
Well, capitalism is simply the dominant economic system in which we operate. It has private ownership at its heart, profit maximization as the incentive structure. But capitalism has never operated just on its own in a vacuum. It's always been regulated by governments, well or poorly, and often it is regulated by nature. If anything, we are understanding how much nature actually regulates the limits and puts the bounds on what we can do with our economic system. And the book basically argues that because now we understand this problem, we as a world, all governments around the world have agreed to do something about the problem, and science has given us a plan on what we need to do. Climate change is now starting to modify how we use capitalism. It's not running on the same incentive system that it did before we understood climate as a problem. And we are starting to see examples of what that modification of capitalism is doing in places like India, China, Europe, North America. All different forms of capitalism in each of those regions is being modified by our climate goals, by our climate imperative.
Great. So I love the way that the book was structured, because each chapter was a story. And in it, you really show how capitalism, the model, can change to be planet friendly. Is that correct? Would you say that was kind of the gist of the book?
Yeah, I think before we understood the problem and started to include many of the factors that are being made worse by climate change but aren't always considered in our economic system, capitalism was making things worse on the environmental metrics. It was delivering on the economic goals that had been set for it, but without the regard for the cost of those developments on the rest of the non-financial world, which is going to finally come and bite the financial world. And so what we are now seeing is an attempt, multiple of those at scale in different places, to try and modify the system to actually work for the solution set. And, it's not happening fast enough. It's not happening in all places, and it's not happening in the most optimal way. But at least we have started on that journey. And the only way ahead is that we learn from these other experiments, other solution sets, and apply those lessons to other places where we need to apply these solutions.
Got it. Okay, so let's start with the biggest challenge that we have working with fossil fuel companies. In my work as a climate investor, I see a lot of companies that are hardware focused and are large infrastructure plays. And in chapter 2, you mention how the first attempt at resurrecting electric cars in the 70s failed because, and I quote, the tech was in the hands of oil giants whose primary business was to extend the fossil fuel era. And there's so many large scale climate technologies and infrastructure plays right now that could really benefit from partnerships with oil and gas. And this is something that a lot of climate hardware founders have to think about at some point. So, some of these technologies will require certain commercial expertise to scale, and the type of expertise that you need really can be found in the oil and gas industry. So how should a founder think about how and when to engage with oil and gas?
Yeah, it's a good question. The point you raise about lithium-ion batteries being invented in an oil company and then not really being scaled up anywhere close to what its potential could have been all the way back in the 1970s is one that continues to play out today, but it's quite different. So the oil industry in the 1970s was going through a very different phase of being challenged than it is today. There was an oil crisis. The governments in the Western economy, both Europe and America, did not want to have a reliance on Middle Eastern producers as much as they did. And as any state does, they wanted their companies, the companies that were founded in those regions, to try and find alternatives if they were available. But at its core, the mandate for that company was to try and deliver energy in the cheapest form possible, as consistently as possible. Now that incentive structure is starting to change. The cheap and consistent still remain, but increasingly they are also being asked to provide cleaner energy. That mandate of being clean didn't exist in the 70s. So they didn't pursue lithium-ion batteries because lithium-ion batteries weren't going to provide cheap, consistent power. They were just going to provide, maybe in the future, after billions of dollars, a solution that could be perhaps better than fossil fuel cars. It was a lot of ifs. Now, for oil companies, there aren't that many ifs. They have to, because especially for US and European oil companies, they have to, because of the mandates, not just from governments, but also from shareholders, deliver reduction in emissions going forward. And yet the resistance among these companies remains because the core product that they produce, oil and gas, tends to be very profitable because often it is not taxed for the pollution it produces. In the places where there are taxes.
And they had record years.
Indeed, of course. And they go through these periods of highly volatile fossil fuel prices where for doing nothing more than they did in the past, they get twice, thrice the amount of money that they would on a normal basis.
Yeah.
So it is, again, an economic system that continues to enable them to make those profits without putting the right level of carbon price that would internalize the cost, then the damage that fossil fuel cause into their business models. It's starting to happen in places, right? The European emissions trading system is a broad-based carbon price that is only becoming broader and is being applied in more economic sectors. They are now creating a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which would essentially put that carbon price, which is there in Europe, on goods coming into Europe. Those could be from China, could be from the US. And so it's forcing countries abroad to think about how to price in carbon. But till that doesn't happen, oil and gas companies will continue to see plenty of profits to be made from oil and gas, and their incentive system to try and move to clean energy will be weak. So when it comes to founders and whether they should work with oil and gas companies, it's a tricky balance, I will admit. Certain sectors may benefit from working from them because of the benefits of having skills that are there in the oil and gas industry. Certain startups might just benefit from having oil and gas company employees just work in those startups rather than having to partner with oil and gas companies, because what you really need is the skills. And some companies might think that's where the money is. That's where these big companies with lots of deep pockets might be able to help us. But I'm not so sure that's the only place anymore, given how much more climate tech funding is available from so many different sources of capital. Yes, it's gone down over the past few years because of macroeconomic circumstances, but the number of climate funds is just growing and continues to grow. So if you're going there just for the money, it's unlikely a good idea. If you're going there for the people, then you might as well get those people without having to partner with those companies. And then if you do think there are real synergies and the oil and gas company that you want to partner with is fully committed, then that's for you to judge, because it is a long-term relationship that you will have to build with a company that doesn't seem to have, even today, its incentive system quite clear cut to be able to work in a climate era.
Yeah, so the context of the question was definitely not just from a capital standpoint. It's really more from that commercial expertise, like getting those engineers on board. They're very well paid at an oil and gas company, and startups can't offer that kind of compensation. So they almost have to be sort of moving towards the end of their career and thinking, look, I want to do something better with my time, or I want to use the skills that I developed within 30 years of Shell, for a climate tech startup. So I think that's part of the challenge, possibly.
Yes, that's probably true. But also, I've heard from so many people in the oil and gas industry who want to move away from the industry and want to find jobs in other places. And you would think that's coming from sort of the extreme spectrum of the employment. Very
Yeah.
young people who've just got into the industry and realize, oh no, it's not for me. Or
Yes.
old people who are like, well, I've got enough money. I just want to be able to do good in the world, and I can take a job cut. But I've heard from even people with 10 or 15 years of experience, people who may have like a pension that would be really tied to the oil and gas company and need to serve it out, who are also starting to move out. I mean, for oil and gas CEOs, it is one of the biggest problems, being able to recruit the kind of talent that they need to be able to be as a leading oil and gas company needs to be in this competitive world. So it's difficult, but it's becoming less difficult to attract talent from the oil and gas industry into what may not be super well paying jobs, but are decently paying and very meaningful jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good news. So, on the topic of capital, you have an entire chapter dedicated to Breakthrough Energy and Bill Gates and the work that he's doing in the climate sector. And Breakthrough is absolutely a model for a lot of the rest of the industry, because you have them engaging, they issue grants, they have an incubator, they start companies, they invest in companies, they have people on the policy side, and they have permanent capital. So they have a 20-year time frame versus the traditional 10-year time frame for venture funds. A lot of that is because of Bill Gates, who he is and the connections he has. And while every fund that starts may want to eventually try to work towards that model, they can't because of limited resources. So do you have any advice for funds that don't have the ability to be tapped into every part of the climate ecosystem, which can be a really huge advantage?
Yeah. One of the things that Breakthrough does is, as part of its impact assessment, it looks at how many more dollars they were able to bring in for those companies that they didn't invest. So, because often these investments are part of a syndicate where many different types of investors put money, you will see often that a lot of venture capital alongside Breakthrough is investing, and they are not the same kind of Breakthrough model where they don't have the 20-year fund or don't have very big LPs who are okay with not having returns for some time. So it's already starting to happen where the core of the Breakthrough model for picking companies was to identify really good ideas, which requires science expertise, which requires doing due diligence, and identifying the places within the transition where there is maximum opportunity for these companies to actually go and play. That can be replicated regardless of whether you are Breakthrough Energy or not. And that's being copied by other types of venture capital funds. As for the other parts of Breakthrough Energy, which you talked about, which is they have a not-for-profit arm that does policy work, that does some publicity work, that does some work to try and build what are now crucial pieces of the deployment pie, where Breakthrough's funds can help you with a first-of-a-kind deployment of a technology, which is beyond what a venture capital fund would do. And those are things that are harder to replicate because that's coming from the not-for-profit arm, that's coming from much of the money from Bill Gates himself. And yet, governments around the world are starting to learn from that. So Bill Gates created Breakthrough Energy Ventures from a number of people who came from the Advanced Research Agency in the Defense Department that was focused on energy, that was created after the 2008-9 financial crisis. And so it is a model that governments can adopt, where they can take on some of the risk of the first of a kind. They can take on the challenge of incubating companies at a startup accelerator. The UK has launched ARIA, which is a similar kind of agency to do advanced research. It's not just climate, it's climate plus AI plus many other things. But these are models that may seem like a patchwork, but require only certain amount of systemic support to continue and to provide the kind of service that Breakthrough Energy Ventures as a private entity does provide. So to me, the Breakthrough model is unique when it was created, but it is one that can be copied by different actors across society.
Yeah. And in your book, you talk about the crucial enabling factors that allow these climate technologies to get to scale. So policy, finance, global diplomacy, shareholder activism, and finance is just one component of that. But when you hear about all of the factors that come into play, it sounds a bit daunting because it's almost like a perfect confluence of factors has to come in for all of this to work. How should investors and founders be thinking about that? Because I think we tend to stick within our silos very much. And this is part of why I love to talk to journalists, because you get that full view, that full spectrum view, because you talk to every player in the climate tech ecosystem.
I think for any entrepreneur, regardless of whether they are running a climate tech company or not, the challenge is just immense, right? They are starting out a business where the founder might have an expertise in something, then he or she hires people who might have expertise in other things, and then you have to figure out how a team works together, and then you have to figure out what your product's going to look like. Like, all these challenges are sort of a first of a kind for the people who are operating in that environment. But partly that's the kind of fun of it, that you're doing all of this for the first time. To me, what has been phenomenal to watch in the climate tech space is that there is a level of conviction that founders have around the types of products that they're creating, right? Things like decarbonized cement or green steel, these are things they are convinced will be needed in the future. They don't know if there will be a market, whether their expensive green steel will be able to compete with cheap normal steel within the time frame in which their business will become profitable or not. And yet, because the macro push towards climate solutions is one that is continuing to go in the right direction globally, not in one country where you might sometimes see politics going backwards or forwards. Overall, the world is pushing in that direction. So maybe you've made a bet on having a green steel company in the UK, and then the Conservatives win this year's election and don't really care about climate, and you will struggle. That's likely to happen to one company or the other. But overall, because around the world, these are the solutions that we need, if you don't win in the UK, you might find a solution for that product in Germany, and you might have to pivot your plans for building a plant in the UK to pivoting and making it in Germany. Those are things you just have to be openly flexible about. But from an entrepreneur's perspective, you want to build your conviction on why your particular idea and your particular solution is one that can survive the next 5-10 years of political upheaval, because it is a solution that the world needs, wants, and will eventually have to figure out how to pay for.
Yeah, absolutely. So in effect, creating something that no matter what the policy environment is, no matter what the political environment is, the technology will survive because there's a need for that. So storytelling, this seems to be apparently the biggest problem in climate tech. We hear a lot that climate tech's problem is not capital, it's actually storytelling. And you're a storyteller. And this book, you took a very optimistic lens, unlike the gentleman author who reviewed your book and on the cover, David Wallace Wells. When I read his book, I thought the world was going to end. I was really in a depressive state for a week. What advice do you have to climate tech founders on how to tell a better story?
Well, first, you should tell me why people think storytelling is the problem and capital is not the problem, because that's the first time I've heard so.
I'm actually quoting, I was at the New York Climate Week and Chris Sacca said that. He said climate tech has a storytelling problem. And part of it is because a lot of these founders are very technical, like yourself. You have a PhD in organic chemistry, but they're very scientific. And frankly, sometimes when you see these decks, you have no idea what the company does. It literally doesn't even say what the company is aiming to do. It just goes into the technical aspects of it. So you have to kind of go to the website, try to find maybe more information on the company to figure out what it is that the company does. And so I actually support that. I think capital, obviously, the climate tech industry has multiple problems. Storytelling, I wouldn't say is at the forefront, but it is a problem for sure. Because I think that founders struggle with how to articulate what the company does in a way that's simple and compelling and succinct and memorable.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a problem that's just a climate tech problem, I would say. Being able to tell anything well is a fundamental skill that is required in any field you operate in. I mean, I came to journalism as a PhD in chemistry with the aim of wanting to write stories. I used to write as a hobby. And you learn by doing that often just because the idea is compelling or in your head the numbers add up or it's so obvious that this should be something that the world will love is something that's in your head. And when you try and convince somebody else, you're unable to do so. You just have to fail once, twice, thrice doing it to recognize that no, it is actually a big challenge to be able to articulate it in a way where your ideas are something that can be understood by another party, regardless of their level of understanding of the problem, regardless of their background in whatever subject area that they may operate in or would have studied. And for me as a journalist, that's a constant challenge because I'm working with subjects that are developing, are becoming more advanced by the day, are becoming more complicated by the day. And yet the importance of these subjects is growing, and the need for people to understand many of the things that perhaps would have remained in the books of scientists and bureaucrats for a long time had we not had a climate imperative is a reason I get to do the work I do. And so I think it is often a very good idea to start thinking about what you want to say very early on in the process of articulating an idea itself. Don't leave it as the last thing to do, which is like, okay, well, let's build a business case study. Let's build our deck. Then let's figure out how to polish it so that it sounds good, so that people understand what we are trying to say. You need to start from the very start, why it is that communicating well is necessary. And it requires practice, but also there are enough people around the world who can help you. Journalism, for its profession as a business problem, it's not doing very well because there is just not a business model to support good quality work. And yet, the number of people who want to be journalists, who want to be in this place of being able to articulate stories is enormous. And so work with some journalists who've done this in the past or people who've given up on journalism and do this as a job for communication. I think there is a reason why they are so good at what they do because they have developed that expertise, and you can tap into that expertise to try and tell a better story. So I in no way think of this as like the only problem facing climate tech. It is certainly a challenge and one that can be overcome.
I'm going to recommend that any future portfolio companies reach out to you for some free advice on storytelling. Okay, so on to your market views. So we're talking in the month of January, and at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, there have been all sorts of predictions on trends for 2024. So all these LinkedIn posts that are basically pointing to the same types of technologies. I think if you read any of these articles, they'll say investors are interested in AI, smart grids, adaptation, and throw in a couple of other things, that capital valuations are going to be down. They were inflated for the last few years, that there will be less capital. Capital is going to be scaled back. Do you have any sort of non-conformist predictions for this year?
I'm not in the job of making predictions, so I don't know. I would say the things that I am looking at perhaps might be of interest, which is we're looking at the hydrogen hype and how
Mm-hmm.
perhaps the solution set on pushing hydrogen as an answer to a problem is much further ahead than the demand for it or even the economics of applying hydrogen to a particular problem. And we are seeing multiple examples of pressure points of projects that are failing, of places where it's not quite coming together. And so that's going to be a series we'll continue to look forward to building on for the rest of this year. The other one is sort of one that is more a bigger picture climate story, which is around how much natural gas the world is really going to need. We're starting to see some of the policies play out. The Biden administration has put a pause on one of the biggest LNG terminal permitting in the US recently, and there's a whole pipeline that may be reevaluated based on sort of climate targets and the real demand for gas that might exist. There was a period because of the war in Europe where Russia attacked Ukraine that suddenly it felt like there may be more demand for gas from other parts of the world because we need to bridge and fill this gap that's been created by Russia's war. But maybe that may not come through. On that side, I would think one place where I would like to see more climate tech companies is what is being done about the methane leak problem. It's a very low hanging fruit for climate good because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas that if you reduce emissions this decade quickly, you're going to get outsized positive impact. And there are a few startups working on that, but not enough, I feel like. And it's a place where oil and gas companies can do with help. They've set all these targets to reduce methane emissions, but how much progress are they making? And then finally, I would say there is a ton of hype around carbon removal. Carbon offsets have been punctured because of their quality and their lack of transparency and the opacity that is there in the market. But then there's been, because of that reduction in demand for carbon avoidance offsets, there's been maybe a rush, maybe the market's going too far ahead on its expectation that carbon removal in the short term is going to be a big moneymaker. And so you've got crazy amounts of deals being signed, or at least memorandums of understanding being signed on removal tons. And the energetics of it, the lack of scalability, the difficulty of any startup scaling at that level and delivering those tons is perhaps poorly understood in the market right now. So there needs to be a deeper look at how feasible many of these carbon removal ideas are actually going to be. And from a climate perspective, it's really emissions reduction that needs a lot more focus this decade. Carbon removal will be needed, but perhaps the level of attention being given to it is outsized.
Great. Well, that's all I had for you. Although I could keep asking questions, I'm really excited to read this hydrogen piece. Your book is excellent. You can purchase it on Amazon. I actually did a combination of reading the book and then listening to it on Spotify as well. You didn't narrate it, though.
I did not know the deadlines for narrating the book were a little complicated to pull off last summer. And so I was happy for the publisher to figure out how to do it the best they could. And anyway, I feel like book narration is again, it's like the job of a professional. I feel like a professional would do it better than a newly formed podcast host.
Got it. Okay. Well, the book is excellent. And I would recommend anyone in climate, anyone working in climate or interested, anyone can read this book, but they should read this book. I would say it's in my top 10 list of books to read.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. I hope that we can bring you back sometime because would love to hear your perspective on the sector.
Thanks for having me. I hope this podcasting journey goes well for you. It's been fun for me too.
And that's it for today's episode. If you found it useful, please subscribe. And if you'd like to connect with Akshat or buy his excellent book, I have all the links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and hope to catch you at the next one. Bye, everyone.